There we go. Welcome to this week's episode of Two Truths and a Lie, also broadcast as Alpha Thoughts on LinkedIn. We're delighted to have you here. I'm joined again this week by Gregarious, who is back from traveling and is here. And today we wanted to talk about brand safety because it's been a lot in the news of late. Just this week, both YouTube and Facebook blocked Alex Jones, but it seems like a drop in the bucket given the fake news problem and advertisers concerned about the context that their ads might appear in. We saw research this week published by eMarketer that talked about how brand safety has been cited by advertisers as one of their top concerns. As I'm a fellow for the Society for New Communications Research, and we did research last fall about this very issue to find out if marketers were concerned about this. And while 80% of them were concerned about the possibility of their ads appearing next to fake news or lies or bad content, depending on how you want to define it, they were pretty ambivalent about what they were going to do about it. And, you know, it was either the platform's problem or it was the ad tech vendor's problem. Or it always seemed to be somebody else's problem, frankly. And then we saw also this week that both Facebook and Twitter, who, whether it was, you know, with gusto or just grudgingly actually started to do some things about fake followers, fake news, et cetera, both of their stock prices took a little bit of a tumble, Facebook's particularly, in the light of the fact that their revenues or user growth was off because they had, in their statement, said we did something about this problem. So that kind of belies the fact that we care about this, but yet we're going to penalize the companies when they actually do something about it. Discuss.
Yeah. The problem with all of, brand safety is such an interesting sort of area because it's really about, it's sort of more of a self-reflective thing. It's like, what is the brand promise? What is the brand value, right? And then how do we want that to be interpreted and articulated kind of in the world, right? And the fear really seems to be more about, will someone see me in the wrong light, right? As opposed to, is it actually a good or a bad thing that it is associated with, right? Like it's not actually like really a moral distinction. It's more of a marketing distinction.
Yet we, as consumers, we say we want people to do something about it, and so if we don't. And Scott Monty, who is a super smart guy, has written a lot about this over the last week. Just sort of the disconnect between how we say we want people to behave, right? We want platforms to do something about fake news. We want ad tech to do something about privacy. We want all these things. Yet when companies actually do something about them, and they don't always do it with any speed or alacrity, right? I mean, they're doing this because they have to, because there may be a regulator breathing down their neck. But when they actually do something, their market value tumbles. And so, if we really mean this, should we be penalizing these companies for actually solving it? Or if we don't really mean it, should we just give up? I mean, does privacy not matter? I hate the idea that fake news doesn't matter. I mean, that we don't fix this problem. But if Facebook can't fix the problem because we penalize it and it can't make the money it wants to make, there's a bigger cost than just the cost of whatever compliance they do. Clearly, the cost of your market value tumbling, someone like Facebook can handle that. A smaller company can't.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's funny. Ruth and I, in our other Alpha Thoughts show, we're talking just recently about sort of corporate activism, right? And just that idea that, brands do in some ways feel more empowered to have an opinion, or compelled even like to act because their customers are sort of demanding it. And I think you're absolutely right. There sort of seems like two of these, impossible knots on both sides, right? Like one on the consumer side, to your point, like, look, do you want privacy or not, right? Like, do you trust the benefits of actually people having more information about you and being able to create more tailored experiences that offer you a better experience, right? Or do you not, right? Like, right. Because like it's a fairly binary thing, ultimately, right? Like it's a very slippery slope. Like people don't really understand that. You can't have a little bit, of it being out there, like, because once a little bit's out there, it's sort of all out there, right?
Right.
And on the same time, at the same token, if a company's going to have to raise its prices because the customer base gets smaller, because they do start to pursue sort of the things that they believe in, or do more value, right? Or if they start to build things in a way that are more sustainable and better for the environment, or whatever it may be, right? Like, then things go up in prices. Like, then you can't complain that they did the thing. Like, fine, we want no child labor. Great. I fully endorse that. Except remember, things will be more expensive when we stop relying on those things as well, right?
And that's, I wrote a lot about this about a couple weeks ago, and it's not, personalization is something we crave, yet we also don't want to be targeted, right? So how do we, what's the line that we draw, and again, are we willing to pay for it? And should we have to pay for it? Or how does it get paid for? Because the last thing we want to create is a brand new digital divide. I mean, we finally managed to start narrowing that gap of the digital divide that began in the 90s, where, the haves had and the have-nots did not, right? People didn't always have equal access to computer technology. And that's, while not closed, has been closing as prices have come down. But if we start saying, well, if you pay for it, you can get no ads, or if you subscribe, you can get this, or that starts to create a new digital divide. I mean, there's no answer to this, but I think that, if we have to start thinking, companies have to start thinking about this differently. And honestly, I think the markets have to start thinking about this differently, because if we don't make it, and it was just driven home to me so much. It's not just the cost of compliance that, I have to shell out X number of dollars to develop a piece of technology, or I have to do this. It's if I've spent that money and either my user growth isn't as much as the market wanted, or my revenues aren't as much, or something isn't as much, I'm going to have a bunch of stockholders dumping my stock. And all of a sudden, I'm much less wealthier. And it's one thing if it's Mark Zuckerberg, it's another thing if it's a smaller entrepreneur who just can't shoulder that kind of cost. So that's our truth right now, right? That there's a real disconnect between what we think we want, or what we say we want, and how we're rewarding the companies for doing it. And we need to sort of look at ourselves and decide whether or not that's something we want to change as technology people.
Yeah, by the way, I just add real quick to that. I just saw an eMarketer thing today that said that, sources of personal information that digital buyers in North America are comfortable having brands use for personalized messages, right? Information I share directly with them is the 80.1% sort of category, right? Like, and I think there is like this sort of customer Turing test, like, don't know me better than I know me, right? Is sort of the metric of how far is enough.
Which is sort of back to that, we talked a little bit about GDPR, and at some point we're going to do a GDPR episode. But when you think about the global data privacy regulations in Europe, that's where it really stems from, right? Is if I give you this information and I know you have it, it's a different situation than if you scraped it somewhere and you're using this without my knowledge, or you're building it. And that's a whole different topic.
And then it's on us to remember that we gave it to them too, right? Because people forget. They're like, "Oh wait, how did you get my email?" It's like, "Oh well, you remember you filled out that." Yeah.
Right. Well, there's consent and there's consent, right? There's sort of explicit consent, and then there's the implied consent. That you give it because you can't get to that piece of content, and then you completely forget. And that goes back to it's the publisher's responsibility to add value, so the consumer never asks that question. Right. If you're sending a good email newsletter, if you're doing something that has actual value for the customer, they're never going to ask, why do you have my information? How did you get my information? Because you're giving value.
It's the violation that causes the problem.
Right. It's when you get the crap in your email box it matters. So the other truth that we were talking about this week was, the other thing that's been happening is Instagram fraud is still big in the news, and influencer platforms are rushing to release their fraudometers. That's my nickname for, all the different tools that people are coming out with to show the integrity and quality of their network, or to show that they know who's got the fake followers. And, there's a bunch of different models out there. Some of the vendors I've looked at in the recent weeks have Creator IQ, CrowdTangle, Maverick is one that's done something. There's a little company out that's, I think in Europe somewhere, that called Hype Auditor, I think is its name, that I'm looking at. But they're all looking at sort of trying to understand the suspicious users, which, well, yes, that's important. One of the things that we've talked about is that we think they're asking the wrong question. And the truth is that understanding fraudulent followers is just a tick off the box item. What we really want to understand is what percentage of an audience actually engages with content. And then if we're a brand, what percentage of that engages with us? That's the truth that we're trying to get at. Understanding that what percentage of fake followers just says, wow, this person wasn't paying attention to the people following them, and they said yes to everybody, or they didn't clear out their Twitter account from all the junk. So,
and I think that feeds into even to the brand safety idea, right? Because the reality is, who are the people who are really here, right?
Yeah.
And is this person speaking to an audience, or are they being inflammatory, right? Like is this thing being upvoted literally because everything they say is being upvoted, right? Like, or is it because the audience actually believes these ideas, right? Whatever those ideas are, right?
Yeah, and the actual audience is more important than the fake audience. Not that it's not important to understand if someone has a ton of fake followers and you're trying to decide if you want to work with them as a brand, the fact that they haven't been keeping track of who's following them is actually an issue too. And when you get to sort of millions and millions of followers, yes, I understand you can't, but those influencers aren't necessarily the most effective for brands either, because when you actually start looking at how many people are actively engaging with the brand versus just lurking, the more followers, the more likely there are to be lots of lurkers.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, we have a myth, because we always have to have a myth. And our myth this week is that brand safety in and of itself is a myth. You can't control all the aspects on digital and social. You can get closer. There's ad tech tools that can make sure your ads don't appear next to stuff that is salacious. And, whether it's ads text or ad choices, private marketplaces, guaranteed programmatic, all that stuff, yeah, that's great. But on social media, man, people are messy. And you just can't guarantee that an influencer that you're working with doesn't decide to pull a wacky, Logan Paul or PewDiePie type thing. So how do you can't control it. So, what do we do?
Yeah, I think, we talk a lot about, we've talked about this quite a bit, Susan, the sort of the idea of this age of authenticity that we've now wandered into with social media, influencers, et cetera. And I think the most important part of that process is ultimately that people are very accepting of the unvarnished truth, right? Like, I think there are moments when we prefer the lie, right? Sitcoms, produced TV, those things, we love those stories as well, but we also like real life, right? Like, we like the idea that there's an aspirational part to it, that we can get to something a little bit stepped above us, maybe, right? Or a few steps above us. And I think if brands can work on humanizing themselves, and I think they do that by, we talk a lot about sort of the human-based marketing or people-based marketing, but if they can do that, right, they can tell better stories that are closer to the truth, and it doesn't require the shadow of that perfection that they are trying to constantly create in the world. And I think it removes some of the starkness that they are worried about, right? People stop thinking you're sponsoring this when it's we understand you to be like us, right? And so I can't imply or impugn any humanity on a brand today because they're not human, right?
But we're trying to be, we're trying to get to that place where people relate to us and connect with us more on a human basis. And that's why we use influencers, why we use consumers in the first place. I mean, fundamentally, all advertising uses consumers. It's just that when we're creating an ad that's a scripted, programmed ad, we're hiring an actor to be a proxy for a consumer. Mikey liked the cereal, right? That was an actor being a proxy for little kids everywhere. Sorry. And actually, I don't think he was an actor. He was just a cute little kid. But anyway, he wasn't necessarily the consumer, but he was a proxy for that consumer, because we want to believe that little boys would like the cereal, or that the little girl would.
Right? Yeah.
So we're always looking for the consumer endorsement. It's just that when it's scripted, however it's scripted, we know we're controlling the message. And when it gets out and we actually use real people, it's no longer scripted. And when it's influencers who, and so part of that, is brand safety is a myth. You cannot totally protect your brand in the marketplace unless you want to be in a little sterile room, and that's not selling products. That's not out in the marketplace. So you have to deal with the fact that you can't be completely safe, but you have to sort of minimize it. And that's one of the reasons why, we think influencer marketing has value, because if you're working with the consumer and bringing them into your process, making them part of the storytelling, as long as they authentically love and care about your brand, and they know not to say racist things tomorrow, right? There's some responsibility on the part of both the brand and the influencer to understand that they're doing something together, and it's both their reputations on the line. But it can be much more effective because it is real. I mean, people ask me, why don't I don't actually edit this for my Facebook page or for my blog. I leave the show as whatever happens when we're doing it is what I show, because it's more fun for me to keep it that way and not it. And then you do the version that's edited down. That
only because I can't put it whole on LinkedIn.
Right. But it's good because it's a separate version, right? And so it gives a different story. So we get 2 bites at the apple, and yet it's still fairly real, because this isn't a scripted thing. This is just, we agree what we're going to talk about, but we don't have a little script that says, like last week, I forgot to plug in the mic, except that I did plug in the mic. It was all crazy. And I think that, brands are getting to the place where they understand that kind of authenticity they do want.
Yes, that's right.
What they don't want is the influencer that they're working with, like Logan Paul did, and go do inappropriate things in Japanese mourning sites, or, we do all know about sort of the background. And that's sort of, I guess my last sort of comment today is, one of the things that we all have to be cognizant of and live our way is, everything you do becomes part of your history. And people in with the whole Me Too and sort of history of your tweets. I mean, the thing this week that broke about James Gunn, the director of Guardian of the Galaxy, right? Yeah. And it's not, live your life as though it's going to be examined, and use social media right, because if you don't, somebody's going to find something eventually.
I think, you touched on a lot of things there. And I think that the idea of, using all of this media really is a mirror, right? Like, I think when you use the example of Mikey, it's about what you're doing is you're seeing your own kid, right? Or you're seeing a future that you can imagine. And I think to the extent that becomes true, then when people say, do you believe this? Where you're like, no, actually, I don't believe that. And I feel like I'm like them, right? And so that ability to sort of have empathy, because I feel like we're on the same level, where we can we have a camaraderie, or we have an understanding, means that there is forgiveness built into these sort of missteps or whatever they may be, ultimately. And I think that's really, brands have a hard time with this, because as you said, the scale problem is sort of the thing they always are up against, right? Like, they can't understand relationships at scale, right? Like, they can only understand reach at scale.
Right. And because relationships don't scale, right? Yeah. I mean, part of the challenge of all this is what you're trying to do is create great content or great experiences or great storytelling, and then have a network effect, but you're not, because people like the story, like the message, like it, and repeat it. And that's where the scale comes from. The scale comes from lots of little relationships. It's my followers and my relationship with them, and then all of them say it or like it, and it's their relationship with all of their followers. And the next, it's not trying to buy all those followers, because that's not a relationship. That's advertising. And when we try to force human things into these big scale models, we end up with influencers who have 1 million followers, and half of them are not real, or they're bots, or they're bot B-O-T or B-O-U-G-H-T, and so it's trying to look at the thing carefully and not try to make human relationships be something they're not. So sort of back to our Two Truths and a Lie format. Our two truths were that somehow we're all holding companies responsible, and yet we're not giving them the benefit of the work that they did by penalizing them, either by not buying their products or by their stock price dropping. And if we want companies to actually address safety, brand safety, privacy, fake news, all those things, we have to actually make it possible for them to do them by giving them the credit when they do something, and not always taking it out of them, if you like. the second truth that we talked about was that, oh gosh, what was the second truth again? Oh, the second truth had to do with fraudulent followers, and really to focus more on not just the fraudulent followers, but to understand who's actually following. What's the real following of an influencer is far more important than like being too laser focused on what percent are fraudulent, because there's some point in time where those don't matter, because if you know who's really engaging, you don't really actually care who's not.
Right.
And then finally, brand safety is a myth. You got to do the best you can to control and make sure that you're not putting your brand, or yourself actually for that matter, in positions where you can be damaged, but you can't actually control every aspect.
Yep. Great. And that was a fast one we went through, but like, I think we hit on something that there should be a lot of discussion about, because it's honestly, I think that the idea of humanizing brands and making them less fallible is ultimately like what every brand needs to ultimately pursue.
Great. Thank you, everyone who joins live and who watches later on tape. And we will see you next week. And eventually we will talk about privacy.
And we love to hear from you down in the comments.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.